So, again, thank you for inviting me here. What I've been asked to talk about is the grand challenges of the industrial strategy. And I thought I might just start, and you will probably be very familiar with all of this, but just to try and put it into context of our industry, the UK food and drink industry. So we contribute as an industry about £112 billion of gross value added. So, if you like, gross profit to our national GDP. We employ 3.9 million people across our industry, which is about 13% of the national workforce. So 1 in 8 people effectively work somewhere in our industry. So we are the largest industrial sector and, taken together, one of the largest employers. The only larger employer is if you add up government and local government together and include things like the health service in that. They do employ more people. But we are the biggest, what you might call, productive industry. So got a huge footprint as well in our country. If you look at all the parliamentary constituencies, every one of them has got a retailer in it. It's got a food factory, or it's got some farming. Often it's got all three, but there isn't a constituency in the UK that doesn't have 1 or 2 of these parts of our industry. And each year, the consumers, people that we serve every day, eat or consume, mainly it's eat, I think, £203 billion worth of expenditure. And we export, on top of that, just over £20 billion of food and drink exports. Can you guess what the biggest single item that we export is? Whiskey. Yeah, I'm just checking you're awake. I mean, that's one of the reasons I've been asked here, Colin, to check that they're awake from time to time. I do recognise it's a wonderful afternoon, and that some of you are probably already hoping that the fire alarm will go off so that you get an early release from this, but I'm sorry, as far as I'm concerned, we're plowing on through this. So a very important part of the national economy, and one which has got the potential to grow further. The industrial strategy, I think you're going to hear much more about, and Colin has already touched on this. The 4 grand challenges you will know about. They were set out by Greg Clark when he launched the industrial strategy back in November. But obviously we sit at a point of inflection, a point of discontinuity in our world as artificial intelligence, the data economy, machine learning, all of those developments in technology start to become real and usable within all industries, and we as an industry have to work out how can we best use these. Future of mobility, and that mobility covers both people and goods. Again, a point of inflection. We hear about autonomous vehicles, but much, much more, and probably much more influential in our thinking, has to be what form of propulsion is used. Do we move from fossil fuel directly to electricity? What about fuel cells, etc.? So there's a lot going on there. Clean growth, obviously, if you look at the first and second industrial revolutions, there was a lot of growth. Clean didn't really feature so much. And now that we're looking at what people are increasingly calling the fourth industrial revolution, I think that the concept of growth without further damage to the planet becomes something which, in a sense, if we don't manage to work at that, as all of us in whatever industry we're in, that's where our license to operate from particularly from the younger end of the consumer world is coming from. They expect to be able to consume without being also guilty of, in a sense, encouraging further damage to our planet. And of course, aging society, I keep reading about the fact that, if we look after ourselves, we should be able to live into 3 figures. I think I may be slightly late to start on that tactic, but there is no doubt that the aging society gives us 3 problems. One is, you have a demographic hump, and we're just going through that demographic hump at the moment. You look at somewhere like Italy or Japan, they're the far side of it. And the ratio of people who are contributing actively to the economy, and the people who are hoping to draw from the economy go out of balance. That's a huge problem. The second thing is, what is the equation? What is the social equation between the young and the old? How are we going to deal with the fact that probably the current young generation are the first generation who are not going to be better off than their parents? How do we deal with that need to redistribute capital through our society? You're starting to see real pressures on that in some other countries. You see it in Germany, you see it in Italy. And then, of course, there's the potential that that opens up as a market in terms of different types of food. So the Food and Drink Sector Council, what is this thing? Well, it was created last year, during last year at this time. A group of people got together who were interested in making sure that the food and drink industry, as the largest industrial sector in the UK, actually had a place and a voice within the government's industrial strategy. Now, our industry has never really had a proper overarching body. We've got things like the Institute of Grocery Distribution, which cover a lot of parts of the industry, but that's a charity, and it's there to promote learning, it's there to promote benchmarking. We've never had a single representational body. The National Farmers Union obviously represents the producers and the growers, or the Tenant Farmers Association, or the Country Landowners Association, and the Food and Drink Federation brings together a lot of different aspects of food manufacture, the British Retail Consortium, the Hospitality Association, etc. There are all sorts of different organisations. What we've lacked is one cohesive group. And when you talk to government, one of the things that they say is, if you want to be seen as a sector within the industrial strategy, you have to behave like a sector. So if they want to talk to the automotive sector, or they want to talk to the pharmaceutical sector or the aeronautic sector, it's relatively easy for them to do so. It's very tough for them to find somebody to talk to for whom they can be, for whom it is recognised that that might actually provide a view across the industry. So there was very much perceived to be a need for a pan-industry body. So really led by Lord Deben, John Gummer, as we probably know him better as, who was Secretary of State for Agriculture back in the 1980s, he really led a group of about 15 of us to put together a Food and Drink Sector Council bid, which was put into Bays at the end of 2017, beginning of 2018, with the support of Michael Gove, our Secretary of State for DEFRA, and DEFRA is our sponsoring ministry for the food and drink industry. And in January 2018, it was accepted that we would have a Food and Drink Sector Council, and that would be part of the industrial strategy. So the purpose you can read, it's to act as this one body across the farm to fork, the whole industry. Secondly, it's all about improving the productivity and sustainability of the industry. It's absolutely not about duplicating what's already happening very well in all sorts of existing organisations. It's to try to provide a forum for people to meet and to look at where could we possibly cooperate better across industry. Now, we've had a model for how powerful this can be when it works. And we've seen that 2 or 3 times in our industry during crisis periods. Those of us old enough to remember the BSE crisis in the mid-80s, or indeed the foot and mouth crisis of the late 90s, will know that actually the industry can work really well together. But on those occasions, the industry was brought together usually by COBRA, which is the government's crisis management organisation, and we were provided with an infrastructure and support to be able to work together. Our idea here is to create in the Food and Drink Sector Council a mechanism that allows us to cooperate together on positive things, but without needing to go through a crisis first. We do want to avoid having a crisis. So the ways of working, I think, I've really covered some of those. And it's very much about strengthening partnerships that already exist between the UK government and industry. DEFRA is our sponsoring ministry. But when you look at some of the areas that we operate in and some of the things we're trying to achieve, in fact, quite a lot of the things we're trying to achieve, it's not really DEFRA that we need to talk to. It's BAYS, or it's the Department for Health and Social Care, used to be the Department of Health, Department of Education, DCLG, the local government department. There are a whole series of different departments. And the partnership between the industry and DEFRA, which is what the Food and Drink Sector Council is about, is a mechanism to help us engage both across the industry ourselves, but also, as well as with DEFRA, together we want to be able to cooperate with other government ministries. So the council membership, and at the moment I think there are about 20 council members, is representative from the entire food chain, but they're what are called ad hominem appointments. So people are there because of their skills, their experience, and what they contribute. They're not there to represent the NFU or the BRC or the BNF or any other organisation. They're there to contribute in their own right and to bring their knowledge, their commitment to the industry, and their skills and their networks to bear on the work of the council. So it's individual membership rather than through organisation. The way that the council works, I'll come to in a moment, but the activity will be delivered through a series of work streams which are each led by a council member, and each of the work streams has representation from industry and government. And the priorities that have been set up, and this was set up in January, and we've just had our third meeting, and we've had Secretary of State attendance at each of the meetings. So we're looking at the manufacturing sector deal for food and drink, agricultural productivity, innovation. You can read those. And they'll bear a striking relationship to what Colin already told you about. So here's the structure. That's Greg Clark on the left, and this is Michael Gove on the right. I'm not sure he'd be particularly pleased with that picture, but we are, yes. We've had huge support from Greg Clark. He came to a recent Food and Drink Federation conference, about a month ago, Helen, and he really did support this, and he's very, very keen that the Food and Drink Industry Council, the Food and Drink Sector Council, really works. And they're being, from the BAYS point of view, they're being incredibly supportive, as are DEFRA. So they're putting a lot of effort into this. So the co-chairs of the council are, I'm one of them, and Sally Warren, who's a director at DEFRA, is another. And there's a secretariat which is being provided by industry. A chap called Iain Ferguson, who some of you may know from Nestle, is working part-time to provide us with a secretariat, and the Food and Drink Federation are providing the infrastructure, the premises, and the IT and the support. Because to make this work, and we've learnt this from the other sector councils like automotive, aerospace, etc., it has to really have a secretariat which runs from the industry. Otherwise, it becomes a quasi-government institution. And that's not what it is. It's a partnership across industry and government. So industry has to take the lead in that. So there's the sector council, and then underneath that, there are 7 and now effectively 8 different work streams: agricultural productivity, innovation, logistics, nutrition, packaging, workforce exports, and the food manufacturing sector deal. Whoops, that's not as solid as I thought. So how are we making each of these work streams work? Well, the work streams are how we're going to actually connect this thing with all of you and with all of us together. So each of these sector councils has really got a number of different functions. So there's a leader of each one. So for instance, agricultural productivity is led by Peter Kendall, who is the chair of AHDB. And AHDB, the Agricultural and Horticultural Development Board, that is the hub of this work stream. And their key objective is to accelerate agricultural productivity growth. If you look at the UK, our productivity growth is about 0.9% per annum. If you look onto the continent, Holland gets just over 3%, Germany 2.5%, France just over 2%. Now, if you're lagging in agricultural productivity by 1% per annum, it doesn't sound a huge amount, but you look at that after 7 or 8 years, and you're 10 to 12% behind. Big issue for us is the mix. Our agricultural productivity gains in terms of crop agriculture, particularly wheat and rapeseed, are actually quite good. It's our livestock industry that really has the big lag there. And then you can look, so there's innovation, which Judith Batchelor from Sainsbury's is heading up, logistics, which is at Cranfield, which I'm heading up, nutrition, which Gavin Darby is doing, and that's centred at the British Nutrition Foundation. And you can see the sort of one-line headlines for what each of those is trying to achieve. And then oops, there we go. And then there's packaging, which, as you would expect, is anchored in RAP, and Lindert from Coca-Cola convenes that. Workforce, Fiona Kendall is heading that one, and that's hub and located in the FDF, and that's obviously very important to the work that you do here, and I imagine that you're already, at least I hope you're already interacting with that. And export, where we haven't anchored it anywhere yet, but Graham Hutchison from the Scottish whisky industry, given that they're the biggest single export, is heading that up for us at the moment. And then the food and drink manufacturing sector deal is also located in the FDF. And it's about increasing productivity, focusing on experts and engineering innovation. So these work streams typically have a core group of 8 to 10 people, and each of them has got a function of outreach as well. So it's about promoting informed debate, it's about involvement across as much of the chain as we can have, and it's about creating ownership of what are the priorities for each of these work streams, and how do we bring them together. The 7 or 8 conveners are meeting together on a fairly regular basis to try and pull out where are the common themes. Because again, what we're trying to do here is not to duplicate good work that's already going on. What we're trying to do is to take good work that's already going on in a lot of places and to look at it in the context of the whole of the food chain, and to work out, are there ways we can cooperate better, and how much of that can we do as an industry without any government help, and at what point does it become really important, if we're going to make progress, we actually engage one or other of the government departments in something. And I'll come up with a couple of examples of those in a minute to share with you. Now, you're about addressing the grand challenges. If you look at the 4 grand challenges, and you look at the 7 work streams, you can see that there's packaging. It's not that packaging hasn't got anything to do with this, it's just that the packaging group hasn't really got itself going well enough yet to have worked out where it wants to be. But what you can see, and you'll not be surprised by this, is that innovation and workforce run right across this. And you will know that from yourselves here. That is the key to this. So what we're trying to do is to produce, and this will not be any surprise either, is a resilient, productive and sustainable UK food system. High quality, safe, affordable products. We do that already, but we're up against increasing competition. Better public health through better nutrition and diet, reducing industry's environmental impacts, this clean growth that we're hearing much more about, new opportunities for a skilled workforce and developing that skilled workforce, and ultimately growing UK food and drink exports. I mean, clearly there's Brexit here as an issue, and our competitiveness as an industry is really important to us. At the moment, we produce about 60% of the raw materials that are actually processed through our food factories are produced in the UK, so 40% are not. And if you look at the last figures in terms of what we actually spend, which was the 2015-16 figures, 52% of the value of the food that we buy, so 52% of that 203 billion emanates in the UK, which means that 48% comes from outside. Now, that's why competitiveness really matters. We have to build productivity to build competitiveness. So what are the emerging cross-cutting themes from each of these groups, from the 8 groups together? Well, workforce and capabilities and the application of new technology just scream out it. Every time you look at this, and there are lots of examples that people are now talking about in terms of finding ways to encourage investment by our industry into new technology, to be leaders rather than laggards there. But what is also absolutely clear is that investing in technology without investing in training and upskilling our people and ourselves is just a waste of time and money. And we need to get those two things fixed together. And we've been talking already on the Sector Council and talking with Secretary of State Gove about, is there some need and is there some opportunity for some form of special project, some special program around making it possible for our industry to be leaders in this way? So are there some tax breaks, are there some incentives that might just encourage our industry right across the chain to do differently? You can imagine a very different set of commercial arrangements if this industry was linked by blockchain type technology rather than by us all sending invoices and payments backwards and forwards to each other. But that, of course, also brings in the issues of competition laws. And that's another good example of where we may have to look to government to help to facilitate some of this work through changing in legislation. Another good example of the same type of thing is, for instance, reducing empty miles. A frightening percentage of the wagons that you see running around in the UK are running empty. Why? Because it's very difficult to actually optimize a whole series of different logistic chains individually. But if you start to put them together, and you see this happening in the grocery industry anyway, there's a huge amount of consolidation. There's three things that drive that. One is just pure scale. The second is the need to reduce overhead. And the third is the logistics driver for that. There's a potential, huge potential to improve that. But if you do that with individually owned businesses, it runs you into problems with the competition authorities. So another example of where if we're going to make progress with something like investment in blockchain technology, which allows us to trade in different ways, we've got to make sure that the primary legislation also keeps up with that. Now, other sectors are finding the same thing. It's quite interesting. There's a group now that's bringing together all the industrial councils. There's about 11 of them now. And what do you see coming out from all of those? Same things. Exactly the same things. So that brings me to the final point where we're really engaging with government. We all have a duty. If we want our industry to survive and to prosper into the future, we really do have a real duty of care and a responsibility to make sure that we make this an industry which is attractive for the next generation of people to make their careers in. And we've been talking about that to government as well. So there we are. You are absolutely in the centre of this. I looked at the list of activities that you run. I was pleased to see that a lot of them are from Cranfield. I'm the deputy chairman of Cranfield, so it's good to see that we're doing a lot of work together. At the heart of industry's most important challenge and opportunity, you're certainly there. There is 0 point in mobilising new capital into this industry if we don't have a workforce who is skilled, adaptable, and actually professional enough and ambitious enough to want to take on the new challenges. So there we are, Colin. Hopefully that's in line with what you thought I might say.
Thank you very much, Iain. Very much in line with what you hoped you might say, and I think it's great that these debates are going on. Clearly there are challenges, but it's important that debates are going on. Unfortunately, Iain has to leave before the end of the conference, so we won't get a chance to interact. So, being a Scot, he's probably going home to cheer Columbia, but...
I wish I was.
I think we'll take time for one or two questions. We've got Iain, because it's such important work that's going on. So don't be shy. Yeah.
Yes. Part of the council, you didn't mention universities or academia.
Sorry.
Involvement academia in the council.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. Just a question about the sector council. Are there any universities or academia represented?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, what we've got is obviously in each of the work streams there are. So AHDB is pulling in BBSRC and a number of universities. Innovation, which Judith Batchelor is heading up, there's a lot of work going on there across existing networks. So it's pulling in, again, a lot of universities. Logistics we've based in Cranfield, but Warwick is also contributing and also London. The BNF that you will all know, Judy Buttress is helping us a lot there. And the BNF has got very, very good academic connections. So they're all coming in effectively through the work streams. There are no direct. I'm just trying to think. I don't think there's not an academic who sits on the council at the moment. But that may be something which will change, because one of the things that we've agreed with DEFRA is that we should keep the council under review, and that we need to look at how does the agenda develop. And as the agenda becomes clearer, we may have to change the membership of the council. And you may be right. At the moment, I think we're reasonably well hooked in through this mechanism.
Any other questions? Carol?
How does this council dovetail in with the work that's done by the Agrifood Leadership Council that Judith chairs?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's why Judith is being the convener of this, because what we're absolutely not about is duplicating the work that's already going on. So this is about trying to, just to repeat, maybe I didn't put it very well, what it's trying to do is to take the best of what's happening in a whole series of organisations out there, and it's trying to look at it in the context of one overarching body and saying, how best do we pull all of this together? And when we've pulled it together, we're already seeing things that the industry is quite capable of dealing with itself. We can get on with that. But then what we're also identifying is a few areas where, if we are going to make progress, we need some help from government or some incentivisation from government in order to make some progress. I mean, agricultural productivity is a really good example of this, because if all of our farmers, so farmers follow a normal distribution curve, and if you took the 50% of farmers who are in the middle, and you made them perform as well as the top sort of 12.5%, not the top 12.5%, but the second 12.5%. So if you just moved the curve to the right a bit, that's worth somewhere in the region of about £1.5 to £2 billion a year in additional value to our economy. And the question is, and when you look at that, say it's about 1.3 billion. If you look at it, over £1 billion of that is in livestock, and about 300,000 a year. This is 300 million rather is in arable. And the problem we've got is that we've got a farm structure which makes it really very difficult in the livestock sector to be able to get at people now. And the question is that the Agricultural Productivity Group are looking at is, how do we create mechanisms where we can actually help people to actually improve their productivity, and this is not popular, but the other thing that the industry lacks, particularly in the small livestock sector, is any viable exit opportunities for farmers. Most industries restructure over time in order to move to the right. That's what happens. What has prevented that happening, in fact, for many years, has been the way the CAP has worked. We all know that. We're not going to have that going forward. So we need to put in place mechanisms which can help to allow the industry to restructure itself. So that's a good example of the sort of thing that the agricultural productivity people are working on. It's not easy to do it, but on the other hand, if we don't tackle some of those issues, and Peter Kendall is very strong on this, if we don't tackle the productivity issues at the base of our industry, it's like the base of a pyramid. If we can't tackle those, all that will happen is that the manufacturing industry will import more of its raw materials. Because the manufacturing industry in this country is pretty efficient, is pretty competitive, and it's well coupled with a very competitive retail and hospitality sector. So it's looking all the time for its lowest cost of raw materials. If it doesn't find those within the UK, it will search outside. So therefore, we need to make sure that our own UK production, we raise the productivity to raise the competitiveness to avoid finding that what we're doing is importing more raw materials. I mean, that's a good example.
Okay, we'll take two more questions. We've got two board members here, so
You better be good to them.
Dave.
Okay, thank you. Really interesting.
very, very useful presentation to see the way in which it's all joined up, so thank you for that. It wasn't explicit, but I guess it's implicit because DEFRA involved, is that when we're talking about agricultural productivity, it's with the environmental targets that are already in place or that Gove is actually bringing in.
Yes, there's going to be a new food and agricultural strategy. I mean, there's a white paper coming out. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, this is not accelerate agricultural productivity growth at the expense of the environment, not at all. It has to fit into the overall structure, yeah.
Paul?
Hi, Ian. To what extent are you engaging with the Department for International Trade, DIT, particularly around exports?
What a brilliant question. We had Liam Fox with us yesterday. We had a council meeting yesterday, and he as the Secretary of State for International Trade was with us. You recognise he's a fellow Scot. I presume you've worked that out. So he's a man of enormous intelligence and integrity. That goes without saying. He was also really quite challenging back to us as an industry. They're doing a lot in terms of refocusing the work that the Department for International Trade, it inherited effectively from the Foreign Office, the old commercial attaché network effectively, and it's revamping that, and it's really looking at focusing on 5 or 6 big market opportunities rather than spreading too loosely across. And what they want to do is to interact with us as an industry. They want to hear where do we want to be. So China is obviously on everybody's radar, and I mean Tim might tell you a bit more about that from his Cranswick background a little bit further on. That we're getting some great successes there, but it can't be only that. It has to be much more focused into Europe as well as India and America. So I think that what is clear is that from the point of view of potential future exports, we do 20 billion at the moment. That's not a huge amount if you look at the UK economy in total, but the potential for growth there is huge. And that's what really interests Liam Fox. It's also interesting because it's in the food and agricultural sector. And when we come to do deals with individual bilateral nations, as we will have to do post-Brexit, one of the things which is really tricky for the people who are negotiating these is, what's the balance? If we're exporting food, it helps to also import food. And importing food, particularly from the developing world, is a really important piece of the negotiation in order to be able to export manufactured goods and services. So you've got to have a reciprocity. So having a stronger export food market will be helpful in those negotiations. So he is very switched on to this. And he did push back at us hard. He said, if I go and sell, that you can produce, Welsh lamb was the example he used. He said, the industry has got to be able to provide that. It's not that, I'm not the guy that you come to when you've got a few extra lamb chops for next week and you ask me to flog them off for you. He said, that will never work. What it has to have is long-term contract-based and reliable production, which allows the volumes to be there and predictably there to build the export markets.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ian.